In 18th and 19th century London, poverty and decadence were widespread. There were three classes of people: the gentry, the merchants, and the working class. And beneath all of these was the invisible underclass, the beggars, thieves, and prostitutes. Entire families, including children, would work for just pennies a day in the factories that had sprung up around the city. Tenements, housing dozens of families in small apartments, dotted the urban landscape, creating a dismal scene of poverty and chaos. Smallpox, plague, fever, and consumption, along with crime, shadowed the capital. Fearing for their lives, no one dared walk the streets at night. Welcome to the cutthroat world of Sweeney Todd. The movie, and Stephen Sondheim musical upon which it is based, are set sometime in the 1800s. However, the origins of the Sweeney Todd myth began in the 1700s. During that time, London was the largest and most overcrowded city in Europe. The population numbered around 650,000, but no one's sure of that number because there had never been a census.
The scale of overcrowding is tremendous. Those who have any open spaces built over, you have people living in very, very tiny rooms. The pollution is tremendous. Over 55% of children are dead before the age of 5.
Legend has it that the murderer Sweeney Todd was born in 1756 in the East End of London. The area known as Spitalfields was then the silk-weaving district. It was also a densely populated slum that produced a slew of infamous criminals.
Conditions for children were horrendous. There was no such thing as education. Most of them couldn't read, certainly couldn't write. They were hungry, ill-clothed, scrabbling around for any scraps that they could get, often abused and neglected by their parents. The only chance they had of securing anything for themselves was petty thieving, stealing bread from wherever. And I think Sweeney Todd naturally fell into that, as so many of his contemporaries did.
For the hordes of children, there was no escape from the squalor and sickness. Even the nearby River Thames was a cesspool of disease. A mixture of household refuse, factory waste, and raw sewage all poured directly into the river.
Most notably, this was a place that stank. There was no proper sanitation. There was no sewerage system in London. That came much later, in the 1870s. In many ways, you're still dealing with a kind of medieval city, which has no proper means of removing wastes of different sorts from the immediate environment where people are living.
With a colour varying from dark green to black, anyone who ventured near the water ran a danger of contracting cholera, typhus, smallpox, or tuberculosis. Another epidemic, which was sweeping across London during the mid-18th century, was acute alcoholism. The drink of choice was homemade gin, and it was being heavily consumed by the poor all over the city. It was made and sold illegally in prisons, workhouses, and hospitals. Parish nurses gave it to the pauper children to keep them quiet, which it did, permanently. In the mid-18th century, over 9,000 children died of gin poisoning. The character of Sweeney Todd was unfortunately afflicted by both epidemics. His story suggests that at the age of 14, he was suddenly abandoned by his gin-soaked parents. He had no choice but to embark on a life of crime, which at the time was considered by the poor a respectable profession. However, Sweeney Todd's story doesn't linger on his involvement with the criminal element. Accused of being a petty thief, he was hauled before a magistrate and sentenced to 5 years hard labor. In real life, Sweeney Todd would have probably served his time in the most notorious prison in London.
Newgate Prison at that time would be the kind of place you really wouldn't want to be in. The rest of the population were in the most appalling, ill-heated, damp cells. doing the best they could, probably crammed in a dozen to a cell, if not more. It was just a dreadful place to be. One of the favourite popular pastimes of the population of London, apparently, was to visit on open days at Newgate, to stare at the prisoners and throw things at them and generally abuse them.
In fact, public executions had become quite a popular form of morbid entertainment. It seemed Londoners enjoyed watching a good hanging.
Executions were held very early in the morning. So you would have a crowd gathering from late in the night before, around the scaffold, waiting for the prisoner to come out. People describe the amazing hush that comes over the crowd. They take this moment very, very seriously. And the prisoner is invited to his last respects, have a chat to the priest, kind of confess his crime, really. And then he's gone, the drop.
The original Newgate prison was demolished in 1777, and on its site now stands the Central Criminal Courthouse, which is known as the Old Bailey. The facade of the courtroom building contains some of the original stones from the infamous penitentiary. Apparently, while Sweeney Todd was behind bars, he became a barber's assistant. Otherwise known as a soap boy, these young apprentices would prepare the soap for the barber to lather up his customers' faces. Back then, barbers played a more extensive role in society. They were not only hairdressers, they were also doctors and dentists. People would go to a barber for a shave and a haircut, as well as treatment for any minor bodily complaints. Some barbers even performed surgery, such as removing a gangrenous arm or leg. In fact, the ability to wield a blade on human flesh was necessary for a successful business. Even the symbol of the barber pole has a more gruesome and bloody significance. The pole itself represented the staff that patients would grasp when being bled. The red or blue band painted around the pole represented the bloody ribbon that was wrapped around the arm of the unwitting customer after their barbaric operation. The story of Sweeney Todd has him walking free from Newgate Prison in the fall of 1775. A young man with a profession, he apparently decided to set up his barber's pole outside a little dingy shop at the end of London's Fleet Street. His choice of Fleet Street for a barber shop was unusual. It was not the section of town where barbers normally practiced their craft.
This area of London has always been a focus for publishers, and indeed for writers, and for scribblers and small journals of all sorts. But Fleet Street, as we associate it with mass circulation daily newspapers in the great age of newspapers, the early 20th century, and with titles in Britain like the Daily Mirror and the Daily Mail and the Daily Express and so forth, is now, of course, today the financial centre of London, indeed a major financial capital of the world, very much like Wall Street is in America.
During the 18th and 19th centuries, Fleet Street was just a mass of winding alleys and small squares, dark and dangerous places where demon barbers could hold court and do their malevolent work.
Fleet Street was also a home for freak shows. You got bearded ladies and mermaids and other fraudulent exhibits for people to come and see. But I believe that stuck in Sweeney's mind. I'm convinced that the location of Sweeney Todd's shop was 186 Fleet Street, just this side of St Dunstan's Church. And the other side of the church is Bell Yard, where we believe his mistress, Mrs Lovett, ran her pie shop. The street is still occupied and there are buildings on the same premises. I mean, that's one of the wonderful things about that area of London. The premises may have changed, but the localities are still very firmly there and not really that dissimilar from that time.
Around the corner from Sweeney's barber shop was the infamous pie shop owned by his accomplice, the demented Mrs Lovett. She was the one who came up with the fiendish plan of turning his customers' remains into savoury meat pies.
Many of Mrs Lovett's customers, for the pie shop actually came from Temple Bar. They were the law students, who were working there, and the smell would tempt them down each lunchtime. And what's interesting there is that she also sends them to Sweeney Todd's for a shave to tidy them up a bit. And they too, it is suggested, might end up as fillings in the pies. as well.
The extinct landmark known as the Temple Bar was originally erected in 1672 and stood near 186 Fleet Street. This foreboding archway once marked the entrance to the western boundary of the City of London. Over the centuries, it was customary for the heads of executed criminals to be placed on iron spikes and stuck up on the top of the gateway. Apparently, 3 convict heads, which had been on the Temple for almost 30 years, were still there when Sweeney would have moved into his barbershop just a few yards away.
The locality of the Temple Bar now is this winged creature called the Griffin, which just signifies that that was the boundary of London and where the Temple Bar stood. But I don't suppose many people give it a second thought. It's just a London landmark.
Next to Sweeney Todd's evil lair was St Dunstan's Church. This historic cathedral was to play a significant part in the legend of the demon barber. Beneath the ancient church is a labyrinth of chambers and tunnels that run under Fleet Street, connecting the nearby shops and offices. These passages provided Sweeney Todd with an almost perfect location to hide the remains of his victims.
Because he has killed so many people, there's this strange odour that starts to take over the neighbourhood, and it kind of comes up from underneath the church where a lot of the bodies, have been stored, for the time being until they're made into pies. This arouses the suspicions of the congregation, and they launch an investigation.
Before the mid-18th century, the state of law enforcement was almost non-existent. The only thing that came close to approaching a police force were the watchmen. They were often old and decrepit men patrolling the London streets at night, armed with only a staff. Criminals, if they were clever enough, had an excellent chance of escaping detection, not just once, but as many times as their intelligence and imagination allowed. However, in 1749, the most serious endeavour to combat crime in London was launched.
The Bow Street Runners were a police force, or the first attempt in London of a police force of people, Bow Street being the place where they were based, whose intention was to go out and hold down the crime that was being committed there. And the eventual apprehending of Sweeney Todd owes a great deal to them. The Bow Street Runners, who were coincidentally checking on a number of missing people, went to the church, and one of them had the good sense to go down and investigate the smell, and the bodies came to light there, and also the evidence of passageway between Sweeney Todd's shop and Mrs. Lovett and what they were up to. The evidence was all there because obviously they'd not been expected to be stumbled upon at that moment in time.
Decades later, a curious discovery was made underneath the demon barber's alleged residence.
When some building works are going on at 186 Fleet Street, later in the 19th century, in the 1890s, human remains are found in the cellar. Now, the logical explanation for this is that 186 Fleet Street bridges the crypt of an old church, and the human remains were probably the buried remains under Christian burial from many decades past. But nonetheless, the myth seems then to have some historical veracity, because at 186 Fleet Street there are human remains found. Although scholars can really find no true origin or authenticity to the Sweeney Todd story, nevertheless, millions of people believe that there really was a murderous barber in Fleet Street.
It is said that when the police entered the basement of Sweeney Todd's shop, they found Mrs. Lovett in the very act of scraping a dead man's bones for tidbits to make a veal pie. While in prison, she apparently got hold of some poison and committed suicide in her cell. Legend has it that Sweeney Todd was convicted of murder for his heinous crimes and ordered to hang by the neck. On the way to the gallows, he was pelted by thousands of angry Londoners. Sweeney Todd was supposedly executed in 1802. Afterwards, it is said his body was taken to the Royal College of Surgeons in the Old Bailey and dissected. At the age of 46, the greatest mass murderer in British folklore was dead. Charles Dickens summed up London's past in his book, A Mutual Friend. Animate London, with smarting eyes and irritated lungs, was blinking, wheezing and choking. Inanimate London was a sooty spectre, divided in purpose between being visible and invisible, and so being wholly neither. Whether thoughts of London conjure up a dirty, overpopulated city fraught with danger, or a multicultural metropolis that pulsates with a vitality unmatched elsewhere, there's no denying that the grim world of Sweeney Todd and the abbreviated lives of his victims will continue to haunt London's dark and ominous foggy streets.